The clock struck almost midnight when Sarah decided it was time to begin her journey. She needed to visit her grandmother, who lived in a distant city and was running late. Heavy rain was already falling, and lightning streaked across the dark sky as she grabbed her car keys and headed for the door. The route to Grandma's house was familiar, but the road at night, especially in a storm, was always a challenge. Sarah started the car and backed out of the garage into the stormy night. Visibility was limited due to the torrential rain, and the car's high beams could barely illuminate the wet road in front of it. As she drove down the deserted road, Sarah began to feel a sense of restlessness. The raindrops hit the windshield hard, and the sound of the wind howling made the atmosphere even more ominous. She tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right, but paranoia consumed her. As the night wore on, the storm seemed to get worse. Visibility was minimal, and the road was flooded in several sections. Sarah was beginning to regret not postponing her trip until the next morning. However, she knew she needed to get to her grandmother's house as quickly as possible. That's when something strange happened. Sarah began to notice a pair of bright headlights that appeared in the distance, following her closely. At first, she thought it might just be another driver trying to keep their distance in the rain, but something about the headlights seemed unsettling. The headlights were approaching quickly, and Sarah began to feel her heart speed up. The vehicle behind her was driving dangerously close, almost right up against her car's bumper. She tried to accelerate to leave him behind, but the vehicle followed her relentlessly. Sarah started to panic. The rain made the road slippery, and visibility was so poor that she couldn't see the vehicle following her, only the bright headlights that seemed to look straight into her soul. She picked up her cell phone to call the police, but the storm interfered with reception, leaving her without signal. Desperate, Sarah decided her only option was to seek shelter. She remembered a side road that led to a rest area and turned the car in that direction. The vehicle following her continued behind her, its ominous presence persisting. Upon arriving at the rest area, Sarah parked the car and locked herself inside. She watched as the mysterious vehicle stopped a few meters behind. The rain continued to fall heavily, making it difficult to make out any details of the vehicle or the driver. Whatever was happening, Sarah knew she needed to find out who was after her and why. She picked up her cell phone again and finally managed to get a weak signal. She dialed the emergency number and explained the situation to an operator, asking for help immediately. While waiting for the police, Sarah saw the dark figure of the driver get out of the vehicle that was following her. The rain was still falling heavily, but now she could see that the driver was wearing a black overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat that hid his face. The driver began walking towards Sarah's car, each step echoing like a death sentence in his mind. She was terrified, not knowing what to expect. The police were on their way, but it seemed like time was dragging on as she watched the ominous figure approaching. The dark and stormy night turned into a nightmare, and Sarah knew her life was hanging by a thread as she waited for police help to arrive on that deserted road. What she didn't know was that the real terror was just beginning. Inside the car, Sarah felt her heart beat wildly as she watched the mysterious figure getting closer and closer. The rain continued to fall, creating a curtain of water between her and the approaching stranger. She tried to remain calm, knowing the police were on the way, but fear consumed her. The driver of the vehicle that was following her finally stopped just a few meters from Sarah's car. Visibility was still terrible, and she could make out no trace of the stranger's face beneath the wide hat. A chill ran down her spine as she realized she didn't know what to expect. As she waited nervously inside the car, the shadowy figure remained standing next to the vehicle. The storm raged around them, and the sound of rain and wind created an atmosphere of terror. Sarah could feel the minutes passing like hours as she waited for police help. Finally, the lights of a police car appeared in the distance. Sarah sighed in relief, hoping that the presence of the authorities would make the stranger give up his sinister plans. However, as the police car approached, something even more disturbing happened. The stranger did not retreat or show signs of fear when the police arrived. Instead, he turned towards the police car and, with slow and deliberate steps, began walking towards the police officers. Sarah watched in astonishment as the stranger approached the law enforcement officers, ignoring the order to stop. The police officers got out of their vehicles, weapons drawn, ordering the stranger to surrender. But the individual continued to advance, ignoring threats from the authorities. The torrential rain fell on him, soaking his black overcoat and making the scene crazy. It was then that Sarah noticed something even more frightening. Beneath the stranger's wide hat, she glimpsed a pair of eyes that glowed with a sinister gleam. They were eyes that seemed to belong to something beyond human understanding, eyes that radiated malevolence. One of the officers fired a warning shot into the air, but the stranger did not retreat. He continued advancing toward the agents, his frightening resolve unbroken by the threat of a firearm. Sarah was paralyzed with terror as she watched the scene unfold before her eyes. She knew she was witnessing something supernatural, something that did not belong to the living world. The authorities were in danger, and she felt powerless to help. The tense confrontation continued, with officers increasingly desperate to restrain the stranger. It was then that one of the agents decided to use his stun gun, shooting at the individual. An electric current ran through the stranger's body, causing him to finally fall to the ground. Officers approached the fallen individual, handcuffing him and arresting him. The storm was still raging around them, creating a surreal scene of horror and mystery. Sarah knew the nightmare was far from over. As the officers dealt with the stranger, Sarah finally had the chance to get out of the car and approach. She looked at the individual's wet face beneath the wide hat, but what she saw made her recoil in horror. The stranger's face was contorted and disfigured, as if something terrible had happened to him. She approached the officers and heard murmurs about how the individual appeared to have been the victim of some type of serious accident. However, Sarah knew there was something more sinister going on here. The stranger's eyes still glowed with an inexplicable malevolence, and she felt that the true threat was still hidden in the shadows of that stormy night. What would be able to resist a stun gun and advance relentlessly towards the police? Sarah had no answers, just a frightening feeling that the nightmare was far from over. The dark and stormy night still held dark secrets that she was determined to uncover. The storm continued to batter the deserted road as Sarah watched the officers deal with the stranger, whose contorted, disfigured face was a disturbing sight. She felt a chill running down her spine at the thought of what could have caused those horrible marks. But she didn't dare get too close. The police placed the stranger in the back seat of one of the police cars, handcuffed and still apparently unconscious. The lights of the vehicles flashed, creating a nightmarish scenario under the heavy rain. Sarah approached one of the officers, trying to understand what was happening. The officer explained that they received an emergency call reporting a suspicious vehicle following another car on the road. When they arrived at the scene, they found the stranger following Sarah and acting in a threatening manner. That's when they took measures to contain the situation. Sarah couldn't help but ask the officer about the marks on the stranger's face. The officer sighed and explained that they had no idea what had happened to the individual. He appeared to be unresponsive to any stimulus and had no identification documents. While talking to the officer, Sarah noticed something even more unsettling. The stranger, who was supposed to be unconscious and handcuffed, began whispering unintelligible words in a guttural tone. The stranger's eyes still glowed with that sinister glow. The officers seemed disconcerted by the change in the individual's behavior. They argued among themselves about what to do next as the rain continued to fall mercilessly. Sarah had a feeling something terrible was about to happen. That's when one of the police officers tried to wake the stranger, touching his shoulder carefully. The individual suddenly stood up abruptly, his eyes now fixed on the officer. He began to speak in a strange and unknown language, with a tone of voice that seemed to belong to another world. The officer backed away, visibly disturbed by the stranger's change in behavior. Sarah, who was watching the scene in horror, felt that something terrible was about to happen. She knew she couldn't stand there helpless, waiting for the authorities to solve the supernatural riddle before them. Sarah returned to her car and decided it was time to continue her journey to Grandma's house. She needed to reach her destination and somehow understand what was happening. The rain was still falling, but she was determined to keep going. As Sarah resumed her journey, the vision of the stranger speaking in tongues and with that sinister look continued to haunt her. She knew there was something supernatural going on, something that was beyond human understanding. The deserted road seemed endless, and the rain continued to fall, creating a nightmarish atmosphere. Sarah couldn't help but think that the stranger was connected to something terrible, something she couldn't ignore. As she drove down the dark road, she saw a flash of lightning tear across the night sky, illuminating the landscape for a brief moment. It was at that moment that she glimpsed something on the side of the road, something that made her scream in terror. A dark, twisted figure stood at the side of the road, eyes glowing with that same sinister glow. It was the stranger, the same individual she had left behind in the disturbing scene with the police. Sarah accelerated the car, her heart beating wildly. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The stranger was following her, and now she was sure it wasn't human. It was a supernatural threat that seemed determined to pursue her until the end. The sinister road stretched out before her, and terror enveloped her as Sarah tried to escape the nightmare that haunted her. She knew that the rain continued to fall mercilessly as Sarah sped up her car, trying to get away from the stranger following her on the side of the road. Her heart was beating uncontrollably, and the feeling that something supernatural was chasing her was overwhelming. While driving at high speed, Sarah tried to call the police once again, desperately seeking help. However, reception was still poor due to the storm, and she was unable to make the call. The shadowy figure of the stranger seemed to follow her closely, his ominous presence unaffected by the speed of the car. The stranger's eyes shone with a brilliance that did not belong to this world, and his strange tongue continued to whisper incomprehensible words. Sarah was in a panic, not knowing what to do to get rid of the supernatural threat that was chasing her. The ominous road seemed to stretch endlessly, and visibility was still terrible due to the heavy rain. That's when she had a desperate idea. She remembered a nearby turn that led to a side road, a shortcut that could take her away from the ominous figure. She turned the car in that direction, hoping the stranger wouldn't be able to follow her. The side road was narrow and winding, with thick vegetation all around. The rain continued to fall, and the darkness made it difficult to distinguish the landscape. Sarah was determined to escape the stranger no matter what. As she advanced down the side road, the shadowy figure of the stranger disappeared from view. Sarah hoped she had managed to throw him off. However, the relief was momentary, as something even more terrible awaited her. A feeling of oppression began to take hold of her. The surrounding atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, and she felt as if she was being watched by something invisible. The rain continued to fall, creating a veil of mystery around them. Suddenly, Sarah's car jerked and stopped abruptly. The engine died, and all the lights went out. She tried to restart the car, but it wouldn't respond. She was completely still, in the middle of the darkness and the storm, with a growing sense of terror. It was then that she began to hear whispers in the wind. Words in a strange and ancient language echoed in her ears. The whispers turned into sinister laughter, and the feeling of an otherworldly presence surrounded her. Sarah knew she was facing something beyond human understanding. She was in a nightmare, completely defenseless in the face of the unknown. The strange words and evil laughter seemed to echo in her mind, making her question her own sanity. She tried to open the car door, but it was locked, as if something invisible was holding her prisoner. The feeling that something was approaching, something malevolent and supernatural, consumed her. That's when she saw it. A dark, twisted figure began to materialize in front of her, emerging from the shadows of the heavy rain. It was the stranger, the same individual who had chased her. His eyes shone with a demonic gleam, and his tongue continued to speak that ancient language. Sarah was trapped, with no way out, completely at the mercy of the supernatural. She knew she had no choice but to face the unknown, despite her overwhelming fear. With her heart beating wildly, she looked into the stranger's eyes and whispered a single word. Why? The shadowy figure seemed to hesitate for a moment, been touched by the question. Then, with a twisted smile, the stranger responded in an ancient tongue, revealing the frightening truth behind this otherworldly encounter. The nightmare was far from over, and Sarah was about to discover that what haunted her was a force beyond human understanding, a threat that was linked to ancient secrets and a darkness she never knew existed. End